So the knowledge and understanding you obtain becomes features of one's person and shape one's sense of what is of ultimate value. So which then goes back to a discourse you had on the question, what is university for? Again, when you come to a university, you are not coming here so you get the highest marks, which is the competition conception of what a university is for, or for you to fix your social status, which is the social order goods conception, or for you to be in the same social class as the former oppressors or the colonizers. So that's not the point of a university, and it's not even for you to be prepared for an interview and for you to get a job. Rather, university is about scholarly excellence, academic excellence. So it's about scholarship, which is knowledge production, getting what is intrinsically valuable. And that's what is most important is of value within by you getting an education. So it becomes an understatement to describe education from the bounds of what one gets to gain or benefit from one from what one gets to pay to gain or benefit from education. Right, so we need to understand these broader conceptions as we are working with them. Trying to understand what education is precisely for and how it benefits us. The second criterion that we think about, we're still on um, desire and value, is that we still have to understand that not everything of value is educational. So we cannot again make the mistake of thinking that just because something is valuable, it is just so we cannot think that just because something is valuable, it's educational. So about that, and therefore we are saying this because a great deal of nonsense is asserted about education, right? And several criteria on education are not taken together. Um, when several conceptions are not taken together to try and sort of build or map what education is for, then a lot of nonsensical perspectives are made, rather. If you decide to take a single criterion um, in isolation to try and define what education is, it becomes a redundant exercise, and therefore you cannot really coil what an education is for, or rather, what value is connected to education. So what Ham then argues to say is that teachers or educational leaders sometimes argue that certain socially valuable activities such as skiing, swimming, dancing, socializing, and so on and so forth are educational and so should be pursued in public education institutions because they are valuable for the young people, which then takes away the point that what is to be deemed educational or valuable, the educational sense needs to follow certain procedures. Right? So it needs to fit in certain procedural requirements, which we'll explore later, of course. But there are also cognitive requirements of knowledge required. So you can then ask yourself, even though these extramural exercises are of value, but do they meet the knowledge requirements, which criteria that one must meet for us to say courses they're involved in is educational? And also then ask, does it also meet procedural requirements that describe a process that is educational? So those are perspectives that are usually bounded or alienated aside. Then I would like to then broadly expand on. So the second criteria, remember, in defining education is knowledge. And Ham says that education without knowledge is logically impossible. And the questions of how much and what kinds of knowledge are required for education engender considerable dispute and raise complex issues. So Peters claims that education requires knowledge in breadth and depth in a manner commanding our commitment. So let's then look at what does Peters mean when he says you need knowledge in its breadth. Now, knowledge in its breadth, simply put, connotes to how much does the person know for us to consider them. So it's really better to think of education as an ideal which no one can fully achieve since no one can know everything. But what is crucial is really the spread in the types of knowledge that one has access to. So an educated person is one who has mastered a wide range of types of knowledge. So the more narrow focus in knowledge, the more we are inclined to withhold the appellation educated. So if you know less, or if you're exposed to less types of knowledge, then more likely gonna say you are educated. And which then brings an argument about training. If you are trained to do something, you can argue to say that your knowledge has been narrowed down or it has been limited. And training then gives one minimal narrow skills on how to do something. So there is even minimal use of their cognition, and therefore we tend to withhold that someone is educated if they've been trained at doing something. Because of the narrowness of the knowledge they've access to. That's just one perspective. And thinking about the breadth question, the breadth debate in relation to the depth, we say that for one to be educated, they need to acquire in-depth or thorough understanding of the knowledge. So the nature of knowledge is one really that encapsulates that knowledge is justified through belief, and without grasping or understanding the justification for belief, there can be no genuine knowledge. It is this understanding and that gives depth to the whole enterprise of knowledge acquisition. So what we mean by this is really that to understand the depth of knowledge, you need to have been exposed to different types of knowledge, but again, you need to really have proper justification, in-depth understanding of this knowledge. So when we talk about breadth, we are looking at how many types of knowledge are you exposed to, and depth is how much do you understand these different types of knowledge that you've been exposed to. So therefore, an educated individual is one who sees the reason why of things and approaches knowledge from the inside of a way of thought. So he has grasped the principles for organizing facts and the conceptual schemes which give coherence to otherwise disjointed. So when we say you have understanding of this knowledge, we say that you have a complex outlook at the knowledge frameworks that are connoted or associated with the knowledge that you're working with. So therefore, the depth and breadth ultimately complement each other, give one this cognitive perspective and ability to see connections between various forms of knowledge, how they play a part in a unified and coherent way. Then looks into this. When we say, for us to say you are educated in different forms of knowledge, it simply means that you need to have a thorough an ability to translate your or your understanding into different forms. You need to be able to translate your understanding or your knowledge into different forms. And what do we mean by forms of knowledge? This is largely connected to Plato's perspective. Plato says that there are two perceptions of reality, and in his argument of these two perceptions of reality, says that there is a physical world that we live in right now. Also says that there is an intangible world, world of being, the world of thoughts, the world of ideas. And he says in this world of ideas, um, there exist the purest forms of perceptions of reality. That means there is a world where things are perfectly aligned, perfectly perceived, and says that the world or the physical world is just a transition of these things in the world of God. So says that quite simply put, what happens, or rather what exists in this world of being, this world of forms, or this intelligible world, connotes directly to what exists in the physical world. So he also holds the view, the rationalist view, that things are lived in the mind first before they are translated. So the world of being is a world where things are lived prior to being executed or reflected in this world. Which then means that in the world of forms, everyone has access to all forms of knowledge. And we say that when you are educated in the E3 sense, which is the truest sense, and you have this depth and breadth of knowledge, have access to different forms of knowledge, and internally access all different perspectives related to all forms of knowledge. So I may just suggest that you pull Ham's book and into chapter 5 of his son to these different forms of knowledge that Ham makes reference to, and which means you can be educated in a sense if you have access to these different forms of knowledge. You can only access these different forms of knowledge. Not thinking to them. So it's very important to have an understanding. So to sum this up, we say that the educated person's knowledge has direct impact on one's attitude and direction in life. So it forms one's outlook and adds dimension to one's life. So hence we say that general enlightenment then looks at uh, one one's human achievement, which then connotes to character and one gets to life, right? So one becomes committed to the pursuit of truth, caring about detail and evidence with a keenness, not characteristics of their in which education thought about. So those are some complex ideas or perspectives. So complex ideas or perspectives that one must be trying to understand. Understand what we mean when we say that one is educated in the E3 sense, right? So those are just some of the perspectives that we usually have and look into when we think about this. So I want then for us to think about the next criterion, which is the final criterion, and that's the procedural criterion. So a lot of arguments are attached to the procedural criterion. And according to this criterion, we say that, okay, my slides are playing around. I don't get what's happening. Okay. My slides are playing around. I don't get what's happening, but let's hope they get settled over over time. Um, so according to the procedural criterion, we say that education, even though it's primarily used, or rather the concept education is primarily used to describe what we will call an achievement term. The value and knowledge criteria that have been discussed represent this achievement, because you get to have an intrinsic desire of value into something, and you broadly also look at its in a way broader benefits towards you as a person, right? So that's how we think about it, right? To say that this task of education uh, needs to be well articulated, right? So it needs to, for you to get this achievement, you need to have gone through proper procedures that will bring about this education. So um, broadly put then is to say that uh, anything, rather almost any procedure can be accepted as an educational procedure, subject to it at least meeting two conditions. Firstly, um, the procedure should or must lead to what is educationally valuable. So that's procedure number one. Whatever method you use to get this knowledge, understanding, value, desire, you need to have, at the end of the day, you need to, it must lead to what is educationally valuable. Again, what is then needed and which is connected to the value and desire criterion is that any procedure that does not infringe upon the voluntariness or wittingness on the part of the learner or the achiever, and can then be deemed as acceptable in describing what is going to lead to an educationally valuable achievement. So the second condition does not rule out compulsion, commanding, coercion, and the like. If the reasons are justified for such forms of knowledge in action are used for the learners. But the point really is that the receiver or the learner, the achiever must have autonomy or wittingness or willingness or desire of value on their own to want to be involved in the education process, which then means there are certain methods of achievement, of knowledge achievement that are not acceptable. And those ones is what we refer to conditioning, indoctrinating, brainwashing, and whatnot, which learners cannot resist. Those are unacceptable, ethically unacceptable ways or procedures of gaining this knowledge and truth. So therefore, in summary, the third criterion is a negative one. So it does not tell us in any specific ways what is required as a procedure for education, but rather it tells us what is not permissible as an acceptable perspective of education, right? So summatively speaking, then, what then is education? In a limited definition perspective, we say that education is what results from having engaged in a series of activities which result to a person being educated. But rather, we also need a more complex definition of learning or education. And we say that from what Ham concluded, he says that education is the achievement of a desirable state of mind characterized by knowledge and understanding in its breadth and depth, with cognitive perspective and by corresponding appropriate emotions, attitudes, this brought about deliberately in a manner not to infringe upon the voluntariness or wittingness on the part of the learner. So since this is really a philosophical definition of education, it does not go without criticism, right? Or readjustments, which then brings us to the central question: which use of the three best describes education? So from E1, E2, and E3. So if you look at summatively the three, the argument will that general enlightenment is the purest definitive form of education. Why is that the case? Because it meets all the three criteria, all the complexities that are associated with defining education. So it meets value and desire as a criterion. So it takes into account that one must value their education, one must desire to have this education, which is not really the case in E1, because when you are socially acculturated to the norms and values of the society, there is no consideration of whether you are willing to value and have these norms and ways of life of the society. So instead, you have to know them either ways as acculturated to you. And knowledge, breadth, and depth, again, there are no uh, gaps or spaces for the allowance of you asking the why question, which then defeats the breadth and depth. You are expected to know the norm and the value, accept it as it is. When you start questioning, it's deemed to be unaccepted. For example, at home, when you are taught to do a certain culture, when you keep on asking reasons for why you're doing that, it is deemed as disrespectful. You must just accept that norm as it is, because it's as per argument, it's always been done that way in the family. It's a culture, a tradition of the family. So the knowledge criterion is slightly defeated in that sense. And in that sense, if you're not allowed to engage with these norms and question them, then it defeats procedure, right? Because you are indoctrinated to do something that may not align with what you want, which then defeats procedure. Now, from a schooling perspective, we need to take note that not everything taught in a school um, meets the knowledge and procedural criterion. It may meet the value, such as extramural activities. They have some value, but they are not meeting the knowledge breadth and depth criterion and procedure, and therefore uh, cannot be deemed as educational. So with the institutional use, it remains a debatable conception, but since it does not meet all three criterions, then it's not really definitive form of education. So general enlightenment, which is particularly a kind of human achievement, which is considered to be most valuable development of the mind, characterized by knowledge and understanding, is arguably the most purest form or definition of what it means to be educated in the truest sense. And what are the implications of viewing education as a human achievement? So firstly, we say that from an E3 perspective, education is intrinsically valuable. And by intrinsic, we mean that it's an achievement. Um, and you need to know that there's an intrinsic, extrinsic distinction. So not an acquisition that can be attached to getting a job or money. So with an E3 education, we're looking at an intrinsic achievement, not an external in that sense. And conceiving education is as means to something is different from conceiving education as desirable and worthwhile um, in itself, right? So we don't view education for what it can get us or benefit us, but from an E3 perspective, we view it as something that is desirable and worthwhile in itself. So we value education for its own sake. And again, in the intrinsic value, it draws us to something as good for its own sake and not for some other ends, as just addressed. So in this case, the primary purpose of education is the development of the mind and one's capacity to think. And education involves knowledge and understanding for its own sake. And the simplest denominator of knowing may refer to simple acquaintance of different objects. For instance, that there are 105 second-year students in the program. So that's a simple denominator of what it means to be educated in a sense. So understanding then shows that's a broader perspective to understanding. So with to knowledge rather. So with the understanding component, then we say that that shows a deeper awareness of the connections between different elements under consider. For example, what is more important, or rather in understanding what is more important when we try to look at what's this knowledge. So deeper awareness then looks into the complexities of how we get to know this knowledge and how it then relates to our wittiness or perspective of how of how knowledge is gathered in that sense, which then leaves us with an exploration of schooling, right? So what is the role of schools in society? I think my slides are again doing that weird transition, right? So in our understanding of what the role of school is, we use um, different classes to it, really. So, but from this, we say that what connotes education, or what best defines education, is general enlightenment. And therefore, the primary role of a school really should be the pursuit of general enlightenment. So, and we say this has sometimes been phrased as a liberal education. So it has already been stated that this aim is so overarching and important that it alone is sufficient to justify the existence of schools. And we also look at moral education, which is like the subset of the above. And I'm mentioning it here for emphasis to say that for the maintenance of a dominant culture, where there is representation and there's an overlap of ideals of a society, then general enlightenment supersedes in a sense. So the official language of a country, the laws of the land and democratic form of government would be considered ideas to be transmitted by schools. So moral education then gets to be connected to this liberal sense of education, because morals acculturated to an individual, epistemically acculturated to an individual, lead to their intrinsic character development, and therefore um, connote to what general enlightenment is. And the creation of new knowledge by argument remains as the primary role of a school as well. So primarily in universities, that's what we tend to focus on, the creation of new knowledge. So as a primary role, we say general enlightenment is the focus in education. So with the secondary role of education, here we say the following are candidates to be considered as purposes to be pursued in schools, but only to the extent that they do not interfere radically with the primary purposes. So we can look at their role allocation. So schools are very important for role allocation in society. So the development and allocation of manpower. So this is an unintended consequence through grading, screening, and whatnot. So this leads to certain people being allocated to certain roles in the society. Schools also take the role of socialization. So that means inculcating certain values, behaviors, norms of a society. So those are like social skills. So schools also help with developing good citizenship and social ability, which is the ability to fit into the social context one finds themselves in. Physical training and development, again, the distribution of goods such as health services and so on and so forth. Training for leisure time activities, so swimming and whatnot, sports within the school, the so-called extracurricular activities can be deemed as secondary roles of a school in a sense. Again, peace and democratic ideals. So that's when we also are culture members of our society into the broader discourses of how to live and fit into the society. The maintenance of subgroup cultures, preparation of change and progress, where the latter refers to greater social equality and solving such problems as ecological imbalance. So we also look at how do we progress society, how do we change for the better. It's great. We also have the hub of social mobility, creation of knowledge, development of leadership qualities, and so on and so forth. Because again, at the end of the day, schools have to play that role in making sure we have a stable society. But again, we have unintended roles really of a school. Firstly, it's for what we mean by unintended, I think, firstly, is that the pursuit of pure education has unexpected consequences. And this is in line with what Ham says over there. So some of these are laudable, others most unfortunate. So they are tolerated because we can't avoid these roles, right? So the following are only some of the frequently observed unintended functions of the school. Firstly, courtship and development attitudes to opposite sex. So again, the discourses on gender, sexuality, politics tend to be the hub of education institutions. Babysitting service can be seen as a secondary purpose of a school because kids are at school most of the time. So what parents will essentially be designated to be doing is done in a school. Uh, Decreasing unemployment by keeping people out of the labor market, personal growth and development of potential, attitudes to authority. So schools are hubs to teach how to, for example, in South Africa, how to live in a democratic society, right? And development of compliance and subservience, creation of social inequality because of equal education opportunity, creation of social equality because of unequal educational opportunity. So those are just some of the unintended roles of a school um, that usually come by. But then the most important question then looks into the analysis component of what schools are for and the broader debate into uh, the uses and fraternities of what an education is. And this then relates to the question, who then should control education? So since we understand fully what education is, what it entails, what's the purest form of education and its implications on schooling and whatnot, then who should then control education? You can pause this video and sort of brainstorm on who should control education. Now, educational control can be given to at least three statues. The first one is the state or government. The second one is the parents or the family. And the last one is the liberal compartment or the individual compartment. So when you decide on education control, you need to consider these three to say, if you say the state should control education, why are you saying the state should control education? What are the benefits? What are the losses? What are the losses or benefits parents control education, or if individuals were to control education? So summatively, um, the uses of education and the controls of education parallel each other, and hence we look at a relationship between politics and education, because the state, parents, individuals are all stakeholders that make up a society that we look into deeply in politics or political philosophy. And in philosophy of education, we look at the produces of an education or the uses of education to try and broadly understand the constituent components of what an education is for. So what you need to then understand is that the uses of education and the control of education have a direct relationship with each other. So again, in the future sessions, then we'll be exploring the relations between educational control and the uses of education. And of course, the conclusions that we end up putting to say, if we were to say that education should be is primarily on the social side of things or the sociological side of things, then who will be best fit at controlling that kind of education? If you say it's institutional, who is best fit at controlling that use? If you say that it's general enlightenment, who is best fit at controlling that education, and why are you saying so? So those are analytical questions that we explore in a sense. Now, summatively, I will then like for you to sort of sum up the work we covered. So in the session, we covered responses to the question, what are the different ways in which the term education is used? And we'll make reference to how it is used for sociology, for society, which is the sociological use of education, how it's used for prescribing roles and designations of the state, which is the institutional use of education, and fraternities of how its education is mostly individualistic, which is the general enlightenment use of education. So we also looked into the response to the question, who should determine what education should be? And we argue to say it can either be the state or government, the parents or family, or the liberals, which are the individuals, right? And the question then is, to what extent does formal education and informal distinctively determine how educated one is? Well, here we broadly looked at the criterions that need to be met for us to constitute what is deemed to be broadly educational. And yeah, that's what we looked at. And I'll suggest that you broadly read on that and explore those ideologies further. And also taking into account the role of a university and educational institution and how it broadly links up to an understanding of what education is for and where it comes from, and thereby making you understand the aims of education, which is what education is for, and the conceptions of education, which is where does it come from and what governs it, right? This brings us to the end of our session. These are the references consulted for this week's symposium. And I would like to thank you guys for watching and tuning into this symposium. Please do go through further reading of Ham's work, chapter 3, 4, and 5. Please download 5 from the net and make sure that you also look at Martin and Coetzee work broadly to understand the project of higher education on what universities and schools are for. Thank you very much for tuning in. Make sure that you continue reading, because you will not succeed in philosophy if you are lazy to read. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.